Okay. So welcome to everybody that is coming to EPIQ this year. There's a few new faces that I see, and definitely plenty of faces that I have seen before too, and some off cameras who I know who they are. So welcome. This is actually the 12th. Oh, you need permission to record. Okay. Well then.
Yeah, sorry, try not to interrupt here.
No, you're good. I think I need to make you co-host, right? Yes. Make host. Allowed to record local files. There we go. Okay, you should have it. How to start a meeting on Zoom, adjusting Zoom settings. Reality, right? So welcome to EPIQ this year. I'm Andy Stefik. If you don't know me, I'm a professor of computer science in Las Vegas, where it is very, very hot, much hotter than what other people were talking about just now in the chat. Last week, I think it was somewhere in the ballpark of 108 for most of the week out there. So this year at EPIQ, we often do our little annual conference, historically predominantly for teachers of the visually impaired, not exclusively, but oftentimes that's sort of the big crowd that we have. The goals are kind of to learn some computer science, but computer science is a really broad topic. It can mean practically anything. It's not just coding, but it is some. Our goal is really to kind of make a community of people that are interested in computer science and get them involved in kind of the computer science for all movement. Basically, this movement around the United States to get as many kids as possible learning computer science before they go to college is really what that was all about. If you don't know anything about EPIQ, it really started about 12 years ago as a National Science Foundation project to make it possible for blind and visually impaired students to participate in computer science. And it began building this programming language called Quorum, which eventually ended up being used by quite a few more people in the disabilities community, but in addition, just in general, especially in high school. And we, at the beginning, was just to kind of develop pieces of the language and develop some documentation and stuff like that. But since 2009, it started with, I think it was something about 5 or so students at the Washington State School for the Blind, 2 very brave teachers that had basically no documentation and no materials whatsoever. And then 1 very brave school, which was the Washington State School for the Blind, and they were kind of nuts enough to give it a shot. And so we always appreciate that. There was really no, the only thing you could really do at the time was write little programs that used logic, which is interesting, but nowadays is a lot different. You know, you couldn't make games, you couldn't do music, you couldn't do Legos. It worked, but only sort of. There was no website, you couldn't do anything online, really nothing like that. Nowadays, there's been more than 500,000 programs written online. There's somewhere in the ballpark, although it's hard to get an exact estimate because it's a little complicated, somewhere in the ballpark of 100,000 users a year. We have all sorts of libraries for all sorts of things. And this year, we're doing something totally different, which is to do what we're calling accessible data science. And we will get over the next few days into what that means. But the idea is that a lot of modern computer science, and also at the K through 12 level, even in areas like Common Core state standards, there is quite a bit of material for students to learn that's really not accessible in standard textbooks and stuff like that. So we're trying to make a lot of that material more accessible for kids at all ages, people at all ages. There's a number of us that organize this stuff. Dania Borowski is at the Washington State School for the Blind. Art Rosino is in Philadelphia, I think. Sam Shaw, who's at Prime Access Consulting now, and Sarah Larkin, who is in Iowa. They've put in a ton of time to try to make this year something special. So hopefully that will work for everybody. There's also a curriculum committee, and they spend a chunk of time. Tim Lockwood is waving. Amanda Rada is the chair of that. Ko Inamura, Andrew Zacharias, who I think is coming this year. Gina Fugate, who's on the call, and Steve Rapparelli, who probably would be here, but he just got married, so he's a little busy right now. So, and then there's all of us that are on the R&D team, and that is me. I'm a full professor. William Ali is the lead programmer on the Quorum project. Gabriel Contreras is our newest full-time employee. Gabriel is also a full-time engineer. He's working next year on what we're calling Quorum blocks, which is our block language. Tim Cluthy, Tim Rafalski, and Alex Hoffman and Hannah Williams are all PhD students that work in my lab. And then we have 4 undergrads, Christine Monsada, Yuri Bibic, Sam Hodges, and Yuri Mann, who just graduated and is now working at Microsoft, if I recall correctly. So Christine, Yuri, and Sam all put together just a massive amount of documentation this year for all of you. I think totaling somewhere in the ballpark of 170 pages of documentation on how to do data science for the community, accessibly. So because I get asked this every year, if you aren't aware, Quorum is under the BSD license, which means you can use it for whatever you please, commercially, not commercially, doesn't matter. And the curriculum and documentation is also under the Creative Commons license. You can do with it whatever you see fit. You can modify it, use it, put it online, adjust it, tweak it, whatever you feel like is just fine. It's for the community and often written by the community. So that's the thing. We're funded by predominantly the National Science Foundation. The NSF has now given more than, I think it's something like 10 million to the Quorum project now, which is kind of insane to say. There's 2 main universities, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and the University of Washington, and then a whole smattering of other universities that are involved on the research side, University of Maine, St. Louis University, University of Alabama, Huntsville, and a bunch of others as well. There's a nonprofit which runs through all the funding. So that's the Quorum Outreach and Research Foundation. And then Infosys with Pathfinders has actually been funding us last year and this year as well. And then besides that, lots of like schools and individual people and stuff like that. Now I know this year we're online again, which, online is better than nothing, but, obviously I think a lot of us would prefer to be in person. We're all really hopeful that will be in person next year together with the Pathfinders people, wherever that will live. But that seems to be the running probably in the behind the water cooler. But we don't know for sure. It depends on society as a whole or something like that. So okay, so what are we going to do this year? So every year we kind of change what people learn. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is just so we don't get stale. And then number 2, because we always invent new stuff, and because computer science as a whole isn't like one thing. It's not like, you write if statements or you make games, or it's all sorts of things. It's self-driving cars. It's, making software to do all sorts of purposes. And so this year, we're going to be talking about data science. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that data science has become an increasing topic around the country and around the world. Notably, the ACM, the major computing organization, actually even created a task force to try to define what data science even was, right? And the reason is because we're seeing data science programs prop into colleges all across the United States and the world. So students are able to come in and actually take degrees in data science nowadays. So what is that exactly? But one of the tricky things is a lot of the areas in data science are quite new and they don't always have accessibility support. So part of what the National Science Foundation is funding us to do right now is to figure out how do we make data science accessible and what does it mean for it to be accessible. So we're going to be talking about that some over the next few weeks. So, over the next week, a few weeks. So this is new to me. Over the next week or so. So that'll be a little bit of accessibility. how you do accessible charts offline and online in the browser, etc. Statistics. So a little bit about, this isn't a math conference, but it's helpful to understand a little bit so that you're comfortable with it. Chart creation in general, because this is especially common in high school and you need to be able to do that and be able to do it in an accessible way, I think. And then computer science broadly, because all this stuff requires some amount of programming. Okay, now a couple last things here is EPIQ, we always have like leadership positions, so people can kind of change the conference in whatever direction people want it to. There are two positions that are technically open this year, which is for the steering committee, and the steering committee members might run again or might not. I actually haven't asked them yet, so I probably should. And Sarah Larkin's term is ending this year, and Dania Borowski. It's possible they will run screaming, which would be understandable, or it's possible that they will run again and assist the community another time. That is on Tuesday. There's a session. So if you'd like to run, just show up and you can run if you'd like to. And besides that, there's also 2 positions open in the curriculum committee, if you'd like to have influence on the direction of the curriculum or anything like that. And that is the 2 terms that are ending are Gina Fugate and Steve Rapparelli. So again, all in the Tuesday meeting. Okay, so a couple logistics things. In terms of all the videos, our plan is to put them up after EPIQ so that people can kind of reference them later. We usually do that after the fact so that we can get them all professionally transcribed, stuff like that, and captioned and such. In terms of Zoom in general, the rule of thumb that we kind of have is if you have a camera and would like to use it, you're certainly welcome to, but it's not required. And then if you have written questions or you just want to make a comment, if you can use Slack, that would be best. And the reason is because that way everybody's using the same communication channel, so people are more likely to see it or hear it, etc. So if you can, please use Slack for stuff like that. If you're not speaking, please feel free to mute. And then obviously everybody should be EPIQ. For Slack, if anybody has not gotten access yet, please go ahead and put your email into the chat and we can make sure that you get Slack access right away. I think I've seen most of the people light on the particular thing. And so that might be okay. But if for some reason you didn't get Slack access, let us know and we'll make sure that you get it. For the conference, the EPIQ channel, EPIQ, is the one that we're going to be using for any conference-related stuff. But obviously, anybody can feel free to message others, make channels, do whatever they want to do, use Twitter. If you want like specifically a support request, like you want some help with something, you're welcome to put it in EPIQ. But if it's for that, you can also put it in the support channel, and then people will know that it's a help request. And then if you just want to banter, feel free to post in general or whatever you want right there. So, and just because people ask sometimes if there gets to be too many messages, you can pause notifications in Slack, or you can kind of mute channels and stuff like that too. Generally, it's not a huge problem because the number of people isn't like thousands. But at the same time, if you need to do that or want to do that, you're welcome to do so. Okay, for logistics for today, EPIQ is single track this year. Sometimes we do multiple, sometimes we do single. But we did single this year because the content is new for everyone. Quorum hasn't had a data science library in the past. This is all new to everyone that's here. So even if you're a teacher that's been a bunch of times, all this material is going to be new to you because we just invented it. Like it's just hot off the presses, if you will, with all the good and bad that can imply. And for today, what that means is we're going to do a couple things to make sure everybody's on the same boat. First is we're going to do kind of an intro to Quorum Studio in general, the 4.0 release, and an intro to spreadsheets and using Quorum Studio. And then at 5 o'clock, we have a woman named Linda McIver calling in from Australia, who's the executive director of the Australian Data Science Education Institute. And she's going to be talking about data science down under. Linda's a really inspiring individual, so hopefully people find that interesting. Past that, we're going to have an office hours session. Those office hours sessions are kind of half social, half help. You're welcome to either just stick around and banter if you'd like to, but also if you'd like help with something, like you couldn't get something installed or the website's causing you trouble or whatever it is that you need, we're happy to help with whatever will assist you in that session. Okay, I think it's close to the last thing for these slides is this year was funded again by Infosys, but there's a couple details here. If you're a teacher, you have to have that letter from your principal, whatever that letter is, that Dania has emailed about a bunch of times. And I think for some people it's gone to spam and stuff like that, but we have to have that letter. We can't disperse any funds without that letter because it's required by our funder in order to do that. If you bought a ticket as a non-teacher, there's nothing you have to do because it's not related to you, but it does mean that the swag will all come out at the end because that's related to that. So also, if you are a teacher and you do get funded by the Pathfinders group, certainly there's no requirement, but if you want to send them a thank you letter, I doubt they would feel sad about that. So you're welcome to do so if you want to. All right, so before we get to the Quorum Studio, if there's any questions or problems or logistics or anything like that, before we get going, feel free to bring it up now and we can talk about it. And otherwise, let's get going on some of the other stuff. Any questions or thoughts before we jump to our actual new stuff?
Yeah, just a quick one. Who would I send that letter to? How do I do that? I mean, or who do I talk to about it? Be the better question.
You send the letter.
I've got one.
Yeah, you send the letter to Dania, and she'll put it in this folder that we have that we will share with.
Absolutely.
With them, yeah. And if you have questions, you can post it in Slack or ask Dania or me or whatever.
Okay, so. We're good.
Okay, cool. Other questions from anybody? It looks like we gained one more. Okay. All right, well then let's get going on the new stuff. So I'm going to pull up the Quorum Studio slideshow, and then we will get to some actual programming before too long. So, okay, hopefully, William, can you see it still?
Yep, sure can.
Okay. Oops, that's the wrong set of slides.
And we can all see it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Okay. All right, can you see the actual slides now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this year for since we knew that our focus was going to be on data science, we made a new version of Quorum Studio, although that's not surprising. We work on that every year. If you've come to EPIQ before, you might remember that we used to have this tool called Sodbeans that was built into something that Oracle had. In the very unlikely case that anyone is using that anymore, this is probably the last year that I'll actually say it. You don't want to use that anymore. It's very, very out of date now. Nowadays, there's two things that you can use for the classroom. The first is Quorum Studio that you have to download, and then you can put that on your computer. If you want accessibility support with Quorum Studio, that's actually Windows only, mostly because it's expensive to build it on Mac and we don't have the cash. Or nowadays, the vast majority of programs are actually accessible in Quorum Online now as well, including accessibility support. We added that over the course of this year. So a considerable amount of that is accessible now on there. So what's new this year? And well, it turns out there's a lot. I'm only kind of scratching the surface, but first, if on the right here, you can see a version of Quorum Studio and it looks very dark. We added a light and a dark mode this year, and we significantly changed the colors around to be more accessible and to improve contrast across the board. You'll notice you might notice that there's a little chart in there, and that little chart is actually generated by Quorum, and it might look like an image, but in fact, that image has structure to it. and it can be interpreted by screen readers and braille displays. So we will be going over how to make those. It's not that hard, believe it or not. So we have had data science libraries in the past, but they've gotten a lot better over the last year. My students, especially Tim Cluthy and Hannah Williams in my lab, have just spent a monstrous amount of time going over every little nuance of what keys do you press? What should it look like? How should it be laid out? What should the colors be? And there's a lot more to that than you might imagine. We've made a whole host of accessibility improvements, both online and offline. Online specifically, we now have this technology behind the scenes that we use called the Shadow DOM. If that sounds scary, it kind of is. But the short answer is that this is how we get things like accessible charts to work online in the browser. Because these actually work not just offline in Quorum Studio. You can embed these on your website and they're still accessible. You can make little OpenGL programs online and they're still accessible. And so we've kind of tried to unify accessibility across all the platforms that Quorum works on. If you use iPhone stuff in Quorum, you can now use gestures like swiping and stuff like that. And then I think I mentioned earlier, there's somewhere in the ballpark of somebody's accidentally let me see if I can do that really quick. I think there's oh, there it is right there. I think we added somewhere in the ballpark of 170 pages of documentation that was for the year. This is all about how you do data science, and we've worked really hard, especially my undergraduate students, but a number of us, myself included, to try to make all of that content accessible. The equations are using MathJax. The charts that are generated have special scripts for accessibility. So we've worked our tails off to try to make all of that content accessible as well. Okay, so in terms of the actual environment, when you use, one thing is kind of funny about Quorum Studio is for years and years, it kind of lagged behind on the visual look and feel, in part because we focused a lot on accessibility through screen readers. But this year we wanted to, because we knew we had to do visuals for data science in addition to accessibility support, we knew that we were going to have to improve kind of the look and feel. And so we spent a lot of time looking at the academic literature on colors and stuff like that to try to figure out what would be not just high contrast, but also what would be sort of visually pleasing. That's a complicated topic if you've never read about it, but in any case, and then we've done a lot of work to just clean it up. So we made significant improvements to the look and feel, besides adding the light and dark modes. We adjusted all the colors. We cleaned up all the icons. We made it rasterize better so that as you zoom and scale it, it looks nicer and is less sort of pixelated. And we also tried to make it so that when you have dark modes, you can still visibly see it with high contrast and stuff like that. Color choices are always a little bit subjective, obviously, but nonetheless, hopefully people like the visual look and feel better this year. Besides that, I'm showing on the screen now kind of a sampling of the types of charts that we will either be able to make or can make right now. And on the left-hand side, you see a bar chart with two factors, and it has so 4 sets of bars with 2 bars each. And those are all accessible in a certain way. We'll talk about how to navigate it and what to do with it and stuff like that. On the top, we see 2 examples of either a line plot on the top right or a scatter plot on the top left. And both of these are what are called facet grids or separators. And basically the idea is that you can have graphs embedded in graphs. Traditionally, to do this accessibly, the best you're going to get is like an alternate description online. You'll hope that someone describes this well, but Quorum doesn't work like that now. Instead of when you make these, you don't generate an alternate description. That technology is now not needed. What happens instead is Quorum understands what this chart is doing, and it automatically generates essentially thousands of alternate descriptions that it can use as you navigate and traverse the actual environment. It's kind of like that. So if you land on part of the chart, it will tell you information about it and summarize it and tell you how to navigate it. You can look up information and stuff like that. So the charts on the screen are actually quite complex visually, but they're also still accessible when you generate them. Now on the bottom left, I'm not sure how many people have actually seen a chart like this, but it's called a violin plot. And basically what that is indicating visually is how the standard deviation is changing of the data set over time. Now I will tell you, although we've made a lot of strides on the accessibility, there's certain kinds of charts, and a violin plot is a good example of one, where part of what we're hoping to do this year is get feedback from all the experts in the community, all the great teachers, on how things should change a little bit to make those even more accessible. Like, for example, do we use sonification to try to represent the violin? Do we try to describe it differently to show the fat and skinny regions or stuff like that? I'm not sure, but certain kind of charts, although they are accessible, they can probably be improved over time. And on the bottom right, you'll notice that there is a separate, there's a chart which includes box plots. And box plots can be interpreted as having a median, an interquartile range. We'll get to all that stuff if you're not familiar. And then these funny whiskers. And when you make these, again, one of the things that's traditionally difficult is that if you saw a chart like this on the web and all you had was an alternate description, well, goodness, there's a lot of information in this chart visually. And it's all well and good that you've got an alternate description, but what if I just want the bar to the farthest to the right in part C of this chart? Well, you're just not going to get that in an alternate description. And even if you could, there's so much information that you're not going to be able to easily mentally traverse it without making a really long alt. So the whole idea is that we've tried to think really carefully about what should be included in an accessible version of these charts and how you traverse it and what it says and stuff like that. I'm sure that we can make improvements, and especially my two students, Tim Cluthy and Hannah Williams, probably be listening intently, hint, hint, Hannah and Tim, if you're here, on what should change in terms of the verbiage and stuff like that and traversals. But nonetheless, the point is that we've tried to make all these things accessible, even for very complex charts. And why? That's because in practice, while we want students in high school to be able to access high school level content, we also want students beyond high school to be able to do professional level work. And so we're trying to make these data science libraries easy to use for young students, but also that work up through their whole career so that they can actually do professional level work as well. Okay, so here's a separate screen of different charts. And you'll notice I'm showing different kinds of color palettes and stuff like that as well, which I won't get into the details for right now, but we can talk about them. The top left is a histogram with 3 types of histograms embedded. The one on the top middle is a set of violin plots, again, with a really ugly black and orange type thing. We'll get to that a little bit later. On the bottom left is a scatter plot without a line of best fit. On the bottom right of the left-hand side of this is a set of 3 pie charts, and those all have their own data inside of them. And then there's on the very right of the screen is a very large box plot, which again has 4 groups, a different color palette, each one with its own complicated interquartile range and whiskers and all this kind of stuff embedded. So this is part of what we're going to be doing this week, is learning how to generate images like this for our own data sets and to be able to present them not only visually, but also in an accessible way, or to generate them such that they are visual and accessible at the same time. That's the idea. Okay, now charts, all these charts are also shareable. One of the things that we talked about on the steering committee, and Dania Borowski may not remember this conversation, but it's something that she mentioned and kind of hit home with me last year, was, well, if I'm working at a school for the blind, or if I'm working at a place that cares about accessibility, how do I take these things, these charts and doodads, and put them on our own website? Because to be honest, we want all our content to be accessible. So I actually spent a lot of time thinking about that problem, and that's your fault, Dania. And so we've made a lot of these charts that you can make. They're very shareable. So there's multiple ways that you can share these types of charts with others. And this highlights an interesting thing about computer science. People always think of the computer science as like, I wrote a program and I have my friend use my program or something, but that's not all computer science is about. Computer science related to data science, we often generate something like a chart, and then that chart can be placed somewhere, like on a website or something like that. So in this case, there's 5 different ways that we can do these. So one is WebGL, which is like you can make a chart that could be interactive and stuff like that on the website as like a little canvas that you can put them there. There are pre-rendered SVGs that you can put on your website, and those can be made accessible. So there's kind of like an image file with structure embedded and stuff like that. There are charts that are kind of ready for publication. So this would be using an SVG. When you put them in academic papers, unfortunately, the reality is academic papers often destroy accessibility. It's really dumb. You can complain to the ACM and they deserve it, because like it's just kind of a frustrating thing. But it is what it is, right? There's some complexity there. You can also create charts in Quorum Studio and just straight up render them or use them. And then finally, if you make an application, right? Like if you make a normal Quorum program, you can also, these charts are just normal controls. So you can embed them into any application that you've already made, any user interface that you've got or something like that. So you can use them in existing applications. You can render them on the web. You can make them as image files and share them around with each other. You can put those image files on your website. Anything like that can be done automatically through the new system this year. So partially your fault, Dania. So, okay, and then in terms of accessibility improvements, so there's a couple big things this year. One of which is that we've made significant improvements to accessibility across the board. Now we've tried to be accessible for years and years and years, and accessibility is a moving target and complicated. But one of the things that we've really learned very deeply this year is how tied graphic systems are to accessibility. Meaning, basically, that if you have a graphics engine and it's going slower, believe it or not, that actually slows down the screen reader in very complicated ways that we've learned a lot more about this year compared to previous versions of Quorum Studio. So broadly speaking, what it means is that as time goes on, as we've learned a lot of this stuff about accessibility, Quorum Studio should start to increasingly feel like smoother. And it should feel smoother in accessibility mode this year. You might even not notice it, but it should, as you're using it, it should start to basically feel like it's more like a native application for accessibility. And this is also true for charts. We'll show you some of that. And online, we have this technology now that is we're using called the Shadow DOM. And this is esoteric, but essentially what this means is that we've gotten much better at being able to make all the Quorum applications online in the browser also be accessible. So historically, if you've made something like a user interface, well, that user interface was accessible in Quorum Studio and not online, but it's not true anymore. Oftentimes, when you go and use Quorum online now, behind the scenes, it generates this magical Shadow DOM thing. And that magical Shadow DOM thing means all your games can be accessible online in a browser as well. And in addition, this is also used for things like charts and stuff like that. The really good part of this technology is this is what we're also going to be using for Quorum's scene editing and Quorum's block system. I know many of you have been interested in having a blocks mode for Quorum for a number of years. We are finally building that now. That starts the main development work. We got all the kind of the guts ready this year, which is what we were planning on. And then next year, the beginning of that. But that will also include being able to do things like Quorum Scene Editor online in a browser and still make that accessible, or at least that's the plan. So you should be able to do stuff offline and online increasingly in future years. So this is user interfaces, online charts, graphics in general, 3D or 2D, doesn't really matter. and then eventually blocks and scene editors, which are heavily in development right now on the team, because we're usually building the next version by the time this version comes out. So, okay, besides that, in the new version, although we're not going to talk about it in the lessons this year, but it does exist. We've got gesture support for mobile devices. These work on Android and iPhone. And that includes, right now, they're basically tied to the default operating system ones that you get for each platform. So far that includes single tap, double tap, long press, pinch, zooming, pan and swipe. You're welcome to use those in any of your applications now, and then you can do that on the phones. Besides that, I said that we have like about 170-ish pages of new documentation. This includes a ton of data science tutorials on topics like data frames, which we'll talk about, data transformations. This is like automatic adjustments of your data, descriptive statistics, and that includes putting any of the equations into an accessible form, like MathJax is what is traditionally called, and then also building charts themselves. Besides that, we've also got all of our EPIQ content, which includes 15 one-hour lessons for this year. A lot of those lessons we've mapped to the Common Core state standards, not all of them, but I think most of them. And they've been kind of guided by one statistician and one educator as well. I mean, PhD level educator on what the content should be for those things and stuff like that. So quite a bit of new documentation on how to use all this stuff, and it's all online and Creative Commons, free to use for whatever purpose you wish. Okay, last thing before we actually start hacking some stuff together is we always try to give like just a little bit of a sense of what's coming next. And this year, sort of, we've got the Quorum Studio 4.0 release. The release notes are online if you want more details. There's a lot more stuff that was added that I'm not even touching on, like we actually added a database backend and all sorts of things that are sort of closer to professional practice. But for next year, our entire goal is around making Quorum have a blocks mode. That's our primary mission for the year, to do it offline and online. And what that actually means is quite complicated. We've been doing some interviews with members of the academic community to try to figure out exactly what that should consist of, talking to people all over the world about what it should be. And what Quorum's block mode is going to be is a little complicated, and I don't want to get into it until we're kind of closer to the prototyping phase. But the short answer is what we're going to end up doing is building blocks into Quorum Studio and building it into our online development environments. And that's going to include other features like the scene editing and stuff like that, because block languages typically don't just have blocks. They are like connected to other kinds of tools and techniques and stuff like that. So that's, we're hoping to get kind of the back end of that done by around December or so. And then we're hoping to have our first research prototypes, which will be built into Quorum Studio 5, we hope, by the summer of next year, in addition to improvements on general stuff, like we'll add some data science improvements and stuff like that as well. So I know blocks has been a feature people have wanted for years and years and years. And so the lead dev on that is actually Gabriel Contreras. He's going to be doing a bunch of stuff. He's now crying inside probably that I mentioned it. So it's his fault if it all breaks. Then William's going to be helping with that too, so, including myself. So that's our goal. So we're hoping to get that online by next year. So, all right. So that's enough of me blabbing. So we always do some stuff like that, but really, I know why people actually come, and that is to actually hack on stuff. So let's go ahead and stop the recording just for a minute and let people kind of ask questions, chat, or whatever for just a few minutes. And then maybe why don't we take like a 5-minute break if people want, and then let's get hacking. When we do that, I should say, if you haven't yet, make sure you download and install the latest version of Quorum Studio. And that would be, the latest version is 4.0.2, because we would never have an EPIQ without a 0.0012 or whatever version, because, there's always a bug. And so the latest version is 4.0.2. If you prefer to use everything online, you can certainly do that too. And that would just involve going to the website if for some reason you want to do that. But we are going to get started on that pretty soon. And so let's take a 5-minute breather and then we'll come right back.